But I think I should warn you that our lesson today is a bit different from what I normally do. I am really actually violating every personal rule about this kind of speaking that I have always held. And maybe I should explain what I'm talking about with that. I'm not a preacher. In fact, before moving back to Cordell for the previous 25 years, I did not preach in any church Sunday after Sunday like I have done here. Fill pulpits in a lot of places, but not preach consistently like I've done here. And so that might help you understand that I preach in series, long series. We've done the life of David, and we've done the book of Mark or the book of Luke, or we've done the book of Acts, and we preach in series like that. And I prefer that. I seldom use a topical lesson, though I think topical lessons occasionally are good and appropriate and very helpful. But I seldom do that. You may realize that when it comes to a holiday like Memorial Day, I usually don't tie any lesson to the Memorial Day holiday or any other holiday because I preach in those series. I'm breaking every possible rule today. It is a topical lesson. It does have something to do with Memorial Day. And, one other thing, I always like to preach, I think what they call expositorily. In other words, you take a section of Scripture and go through it. Not even doing that today. Now, everybody want to leave? It is a bit different. And if you've been following what I've done here, every time we come to Memorial Day, I always say this same thing. It is the first major holiday of our summer season. People now begin this travel season with Memorial Day holiday. And it was originally, I always say, instituted as a national holiday so that we would remember those who have fallen in battle. But over time, we've expanded that, and rightfully so, to remember everyone who has ever served in the armed forces. And over time, we have expanded that, and rightfully so, to remember all of our loved ones who have preceded us. And so one of the ways we do that is you go out to the cemetery today and you'll find the grave sites decorated with more flowers than usual. And in some cemeteries, like the one I went to yesterday morning, really early, I drove a mile south of Cowden, a half mile back west to the Sappan Cemetery. It was manicured beautifully. Flowers were in a lot of locations, but there were little American flags all over the cemetery at every headstone of a veteran. And so we use that to remember. So I want to begin with that thought this morning. And I want to tell you that I remember in the course of my life a lot of things. And as I'm saying this, I want you to think about things that you remember. I think my memory can go back to the age of 3. And I think I can remember at the age of 3 a great big white horse, and it was a large white horse. And we were living halfway between Dill City and Burns Flat, about 2 or 3 miles south of where you lived. And this horse was obviously really, really gentle. Really gentle. Except if he had been out in the pasture. And I can remember an old yellow pickup with my dad. And if that horse had been in the pasture, I can remember driving across that rough pasture, and I was balancing high in the seat until we finally captured that horse, and then perfectly gentle. And so my mom and dad would put me on the horse. No saddle. We didn't own a saddle that would fit me. And they would call the neighbors and have the neighbors on alert that I was riding to their house a quarter of a mile away. And I'd pull up to the Woods family, and they would have a fence there with a set of steps, and I would ride up against the steps and climb down the steps. I remember all that. I remember when I was 6 on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of wheat harvest, our house burning. I remember certain things about grade school and junior high school and high school. Some things good and some things not so good. I remember when Susan and I started dating. I remembered getting married. Now, are you remembering things? I remember when our 2 children were born. I remember when our grandchildren were born. I remember certain things about our children when they were growing up. I remember going to college and taking what seemed to be an enormous number of math classes. I just remember a lot of things. I remember different places Susan and I have lived. We've moved several different times. Do you remember a lot? It's a blessing to be able to go back in time and just remember. We all remember a lot, don't we? But here's the thought that kept coming to my mind all week, and even longer than a week. It's been in 2 weeks. A thought that keeps coming to my mind. I think it's a truth, and the truth is this: I have forgotten more than I have remembered. Now think about that. I have forgotten far more than I remember. Susan will oftentimes mention someone from Lubbock. She can call their name, and people we have known, and I can't quite get the picture right. I can't quite remember. And it's so often. I was in Wichita Falls not very long ago, a few weeks ago, speaking on a Thursday night, and different people would come up and said, "Do you remember when? Do you remember?" And I'm scratching my head thinking, "Do I remember that?" And realize I have forgotten far more than I remember. Is that true for you? Have you forgotten far more than you remember? And so that's why we have monuments. That's why you can go to some space like Washington, D.C. and walk on the famous mall and you see this great big giant tall tower, and it's called the Washington Monument, and you are caused to remember that George Washington was our first president of the United States. And as I recall, you can go behind that one and you see this other big memorial or monument, and inside that there's this huge figure of a man with his hands out on the edge of a chair. And you realize it's Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president. And you can go to this wall, and it's got all these names on it of all the people who were killed during the Vietnam War. And all those monuments cause you to remember, because you and I forget more than we remember. We forget more than we remember. Do you remember all those math classes I told you I took? I remember taking college algebra and trig. I remember taking calculus and analytical geometry. I remember taking calculus 1, calculus 2, differential equations, linear algebra, probability theory. I don't remember any of it. I don't remember anything. I have forgotten so much. And we have things that cause us to remember. So I go out to Sapling Cemetery, I get out of my pickup, I walk over and look in front of Grandpa and Grandma's gravestone. And certain memories start coming back, because those monuments make us remember, because I have forgotten more than I remember. Scott's back here in the back, his brother Randy, I think he's our town historian, though he lives far away in the Knoxville area. He's always sending me reminders of various things. So the other day I was in a parking lot in Edmond, and I looked over and saw this bright 2-door red Chevrolet car. Now it was a 64 model. Randy had a 63 model, but I took a picture, I texted it to Randy, and I said, "It's close." And Randy comes back and tells me who he bought that car from, how many miles it had when it sold, and all these different things. All I can remember is Randy had a really pretty 2-door, bright 63 Chevy car. And I sent it to him so he could remember. Because we've forgotten so much more than we remember. Everybody understand that? I have forgotten so many very special things. We have monuments. If you really want to remember, you go to a museum. I don't like museums, but you go to a museum. Susan and I had a quick trip to Nashville in January, and we went, had a half day free before we left. We went down to this battlefield site, and we go to this old house, and there was a surprise battle there during the Civil War, a surprise. And we went all through the house and saw all the furniture. A lot of the furniture was like what Nell had in her house out here. But we saw on the floor, the hardwood floor, the big massive blood stains where they were doing emergency surgeries. And we're caused to remember. Because you need all those kind of reminders. You still with me? Because you and I forget more than we remember. We have a closet in our house full of picture albums. I mean, it's full. And you can pull a picture album out and you can look through it and you can see our children from all the way through. I refuse to look at any of them. Though I probably need the reminder, I refuse because it's just too sad. I get so sad when I start looking at them. And you're wondering, what in the world does all this have to do with what we're doing this morning? The principle is we forget more than we remember. So I want you to think about the ones that we call the children of Israel. And I want you to think, and they're descendants of Abraham, and then there was Isaac, and then there was Jacob, and there was Joseph, and now after Joseph's time, this massive amount of people, they're in this land of Egypt, and they become slaves. Do you remember how long they're slaves? A little more than 400 years. Now, when I went to that cemetery yesterday, I could have walked to every gravestone, and I wouldn't have found anything close to 400 years. I mean, that's a long, long time. Do you know that they did not have a Bible? Do you know that they did not have at that time the scroll that like Isaiah would have written? That's a long time yet to come. You know that they don't even have the law that was written by Moses? That's a long time yet to come. They have virtually nothing for 400 years. And yet it says in that story that they keep crying out to God for some kind of deliverance. They keep knowing that God is able to do anything and that God will be able to do something for them. And they're in all this pain and this misery of Egyptian bondage, and they're crying out for help, just exactly like we do all the time. When we have problems and difficulties, and again, rightfully so, we cry out to God for help. How did they know? How did they know? How did they know that God was so amazing, could do anything? So it had to be that parents told their children. And those children in turn told their children. And those children in turn told their children about this God who called Abraham. And Abraham believed, and he left, and it was called faith. And the amazing things God did in Abraham's life. Do you think they told their children the story of Lot and Abraham and how Lot got himself in trouble at some wicked cities called Sodom and Gomorrah? And do you think they told their children about Isaac and Isaac taking a wife? And do you think they talked about Jacob and Esau and how Jacob's name was changed to Israel? Do you think they told the stories of Joseph when he used to be in the dungeon of Pharaoh and when all of a sudden he's taken out because he, by the power of God, was able to interpret a dream? They told these stories. I had to over and over again because people forget far more than they remember. They had to tell these stories So those people would know, yes, there is a God, and we won't give up on this God. We'll keep calling out to him. Is that making sense to you? Because we have a tendency to forget, and we forget far more than we remember. And so we come to these assemblies. And I do like to preach through series. And sometimes they do maybe get longer than you want them to preach. I had a meeting with a Baptist preacher that preaches at the large Baptist church around the corner from the campus. And I met him, I smiled, and I said, I've been wanting to meet you because I have watched you on your sign preach through the book of Romans. I have watched you preach through the book of Matthew. I've watched you preach through, because he preaches through these long series. And I'm wondering, how did you learn? How did you do this? It was a delightful meeting to hear his background and what he had done. But do you know how it makes me feel sometimes to stand here and think, I'm going to mention again today in some fashion the Red Sea. Do you know what happened to the Red Sea? See, everybody knows that happened to the Red Sea. Everybody in this audience knows. You know exactly what happens at the Red Sea. And here I am talking about it again. Or I'm going to mention again this, or this, or this, or this. And how many times have you heard it? And sometimes I can get concerned about that. And I get bothered that I'm going to bore you. Or you're going to go weary with these things that I talk about over and over again. But I want you to look at something Peter says. It's in 2 Peter. Just a brief statement. If I would read the verse that comes after that, you would know that Peter is saying that God has already informed me that I'm about to die. My life is about over. So he says, here's what I do. I will always remind you of these things, even though you know them and are firmly established in the truth you now have. Even though you know, even though you understand, even though you've heard it before, I will keep reminding you. I think it's right to refresh your memory as long as I live in this tent of this body. As long as I'm able to, Peter says, I think it's the best thing I can do is to keep reminding you, because you have a tendency to what? Forget more than you remember. So I want to ask you to think with me, why do we come to these assemblies? Why do we come to these assemblies? There are some people, even here this morning, who have driven over 30 miles to be in this assembly. Why do they come to these assemblies? Well, we know from Hebrews chapter 10, one of the primary things that we ought to do in this assembly is to create an environment so that we encourage one another unto more love and more good works. And I'm telling you, I am so conscious of that, because if you come here and you don't leave encouraged, if I say something in a certain way that discourages you or deflates you, or what, if something's not worked right, I know that we're supposed to encourage each other, and we meet this little bit of time so that you are ready to go out and walk as a kingdom person even another week. I know that's part of the purpose. But part of the purpose is to remind us over and over and over again of the important concepts of Scripture, the important concepts of God. Because what if you didn't come? What if you didn't come for 2 weeks and 3 weeks? What if you didn't come for a month? And what if you didn't come and you also didn't read anything in this book that I have behind me? or you didn't listen to some material, what if you just left it alone for a space of time? You forget more than you remember. And so when we come together, yes, we rehearse things, but isn't it important for us to never lose sight of this God who is so great that he can but speak and this earth appears? He can but speak and this universe that is so vast that no human has ever been able to build a telescope sophisticated enough to see the extent of this universe. He made it all just by talking about it. And isn't it so interesting the magnitude of God to think about how he made every one of us different? Do you ever stop to marvel at looking from person to person to person to person, millions and millions of people, more than 4 billion people on this earth at a given moment, and not a one of them looks the same? Isn't that amazing? Not a one of them looks the same by the design and the fingerprint of God. And when we talk about God, who is this God of unlimited power, with him, indeed, all things are possible. And so you think it's important for me to be reminded from umpteen stories in the Scripture that by faith, God can work in our lives and he can kill any giant that we face. You think it's important to remember that? Because there are moments when I get so burdened with life and things get so heavy and I think it looks so impossible that I begin to shrink back and want to give up until I remember that there is this God who delights in my weakness and who delights in doing mighty things through people who can't do it by themselves. And do you think it's important for us to stand here and talk about the great feats that God enabled Elijah to do? We're talking about one of my favorites of all time is Gideon. Not this Gideon, but kind of like this Gideon. By the way, this preacher I was talking about that preaches these series, his last name is Gideon. I said, you got the name for it. Mighty warrior. You got the name for it. But I love to see this young man who says, I can't do this. And he even questions God, said, God, I'm so unsure, could I put a fleece out? Could we deal with some dew? And it happens, and he says, could I do it one more time? I just got to be sure. And I think that sounds so much like me. Do you think it's important to be reminded? Do you think it's important to be reminded of the enormous love that God has for us? There are so many people in this little town of Cordell right now that do not feel loved by anyone. I wish they could know how much God loves them. I don't care what they're into. I don't care what a mess they made of their lives. I don't care anything about. God really loves them. And we take this little memorial. We take this every Sunday. And I know there are some problems with this. Some people think that they got to take this because it's such a command if they happen to miss that they have sinned. That's a 180-degree opposite look at this emblem. It's not that reason. God gave this to us for our benefit because God knew that we would forget more than we would remember. And the most important thing that God ever done was not creating this world. The most important thing God ever did was saving this world. And the only way to save this world was to send his son to this earth. Nothing compares to that one event. For God so loved the world that he sent his only son. And without the shedding of that blood on the cross, that's what we remember. There is no forgiveness. There is no hope. And it's this that causes us to remember, gives us the opportunity to remember that he was raised from the dead. And so those cemeteries you put flowers on, it's not the end. It's not the end. There are just some things that are really important that you and I need to remember, because we have a tendency to forget more than we remember, and this is the most important of all. I know the problem with it. Taking it week after week after week becomes such a habit. Will it bother you if I tell you that there are sometimes I take this and don't even think about it? What a mistake. What a mistake. Because it was designed only to help me remember that which is so important, because we so easily forget. And Peter's telling these people, I'm about to die. God has told me my time is up. And I think while I'm still here in this tent, I have one job I got to do, and that's keep reminding you over and over and over again of what is really important. Because you have a tendency to forget, and if you forget, all could be lost. So on this Memorial Day, we have people gone. I understand it's the summertime. Even when you're gone, so many. This is a beautiful thing of technology. I have this love-hate relationship with technology. I really do. But think about it. The Gosens can be gone on harvest, and the combines need to be running by 11 o'clock, and they can watch online. They can gather together as a family during the middle of busy harvest, and they can remember, be reminded. Am I making my point? Here's the principle. Always will be true, I think. We will forget more than we remember. Always. But we need to be reminded. And so as we take the Lord's Supper this morning, I hope you're reminded of the great love of God that is shown through his Son Jesus. It's the only story. It's the only story that is the most important story. There are other stories that are really, really important, but it's the only story that is most important story. Because without it, none of the rest of it matters.